Okay, so we're live. So this is Claudia Filos, and this is another CHS open house discussion with Ali Marbury and Gregory Nagy. Thanks so much for joining us. And we have many cherished members of our community here. Would you like to introduce yourselves? So, Sarah, maybe would you like to go first?
Hello, I'm Sarah Scott, and I'm beaming in from Scotland.
Hi.
And Renan?
Hi, my name is Renan. I live in Brazil.
And Kimmy?
Hi, my name is Kimmy McIver, and I live in Canada.
And Jessica?
Hi, my name is Jessica Eichelberg, and I'm in Massachusetts.
And Janet?
Hi, this is Janet Osolak from New City, New York.
And Jackie?
Hi, Jackie Donlan from Boston, Mass.
And then Bill?
Good morning. Bill Moulton from Petersburg, Alaska.
And I'm joining from north of Boston. So, Greg and Ali, thanks so much again for joining us on this open house discussion. We like to have very informal conversations with members of our community, both the people who have participated in the Heroes X project and also just the people who are interested in the work of the center. And we're starting to really build a community around that important mission. And so today, Greg, we were hoping that we might start having a talk about something that's very near and dear to you, and that's the idea of oral poetics, right? So our community and the CHS community is very interested in this approach to ancient Greek literature and to understanding this important aspect about the literature that we've been reading together. And so we're hoping that you might address a question that Kimmy has raised, and she might give us an idea about what kind of details she's looking forward to getting from you about that. Kimmy, can you share a question?
Well, I get a little bit tongue-tied when I have to speak, but basically my question was, how do we understand Homeric poetry to other types of poetry? And I've been sort of reading bits and pieces here and there, and such thing as the epic cycle versus, you know, Iliad and Odyssey, and do they share a body of knowledge or tradition or history as a background that led them, you know, gave birth to, you know, the Iliad, Odyssey, or other types of poetics? And that's basically where I started. And please, Greg, jump in.
Okay. So, a very important word that Kimmy used in her question is body of poetry. And I like that metaphor because a body is something that conveys an organism, something that is not just systematic, but something that is alive. And oral poetry is alive. It's a phenomenon that is there whether we define it or not. It existed before the technology of writing was ever invented anywhere. It was already there. And the basic way to think of oral poetry or oral traditions in general is to think simultaneously of composition and performance. That's something that a writerly culture finds it hard to do. Composition and performance. But as my teacher, Albert Lord, taught me, and he can teach you through that wonderful 1960 book, The Singer of Tales, oral poetry comes alive in performance. That is to say, you cannot ever think of composition in oral poetry without thinking at the same time about performance. Performance and composition are part of the same process. There is, therefore, composition in performance. And the degree to which there is recomposition with each performance will vary from tradition to tradition. It will vary even within a tradition as you go through time. I will cite two books where I've talked a great deal about all of this. And I think these are the two books that are easiest to start with. Number one is a book called Homeric Questions. I emphasize questions in the plural, published by University of Texas Press in 1996 and available for free on the web of the Center for Hellenic Studies. So that was number one, Homeric Questions. And I keep saying questions because a lot of people go around saying the Homeric question as if there were only one. And it's all about, let me just give it away, spoiler alert, it's all about writing. That's what a simplistic view of a supposedly unified question, the Homeric question, is all about. Enough said. Second book that I would recommend to you is Poetry as Performance, Homer and Beyond, also published in 1996, the twin of Homeric Questions. This was a set of lectures that I delivered at the University of Cambridge, and that eventually became this book called Poetry as Performance. And I want to single out one detail, dear Kimmy, in that book, which relates to the use of your metaphor body of oral poetry. Remember, body. And there in Poetry as Performance, and to some degree also in the twin book, in the first twin, Homeric Questions, I give you another metaphor, and this metaphor comes from the ancient world. This metaphor is cycle. Yes, you heard me, cycle. You yourself, dear Kimmy, were talking about what is called by modern classicists the Homeric cycle, but I want you to put that on hold for a while and think of the Greek word kuklos, K-U-K-L-O-S, which in Latinized form is C-Y-C-L-U-S, and that's what gives us the English borrowing cycle. Now, kuklos in ancient Greek meant circle, meant something like cycle the way we use cycle in everyday English. But you know what it meant most concretely? It meant a chariot wheel. And it was this shining metaphor for what was considered to be one of the greatest arts of the ancient world, and that was, you're thinking it's going to be poetry, but let me surprise you, it was the art of a master carpenter building a chariot wheel, which was considered one of the greatest technological and artistic challenges for the world of artisans in, let's say, the second millennium BCE. And Kuklos, chariot wheel, comes to life in a metaphor that says, and there are many variations on this theme, dear Kimmy, but it basically says, I am going to construct my song, I'm going to compose my song the same way that a master carpenter constructs a chariot wheel. So what you have here is not just a model for Homeric poetry, it is an archetype, shall we say, a prototype for Homeric poetry in the imaginary world of artisans and artists from the second millennium BCE forward in time. And I'm using second millennium only because I've got to start somewhere for now, as somebody who reconstructs these systems. Now, equally important, I must tell you a historical fact, which is that before the days of Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, the word cycle, as applied to poetry, applied to all poetry ascribed to Homer, all of it. Not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, but if you're thinking in terms of the 6th century and earlier, things like the Song of the Ethiopians, the so-called Little Iliad, the so-called destruction of Troy, the so-called Kypria, and the list goes on and on and on. To put it another way, what becomes in the era of Aristotle a differentiation where Homer is the quote-unquote author of only the Iliad and the Odyssey and maybe one other piece of poetry, must be viewed against the backdrop of an earlier time when Homeric poetry was considered to be not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, but everything else. Homer was the notional author, or may I put it better, maker of all poetry that we think of as Iliad, Odyssey, and the cycle. And here's where it gets really good. If the kyklos is not just a circle or a cycle, but also specifically, concretely, idealistically, a perfect chariot wheel, so also Homeros, if you examine its etymology, and this is what I try to do in the book Poetry as Performance, 1996, the word Homer, the name of Homer itself means chariot wheel carpenter. How do you like that? If that works, then you see it all comes together. And so what are we really talking about, Kimmy, as I now come full circle, no pun intended, in my disquisition about oral poetics? I'm saying that what you call a body of poetry, and I like that metaphor, can also be visualized as a perfectly put together system of poetry about the heroic world that is ascribed to the authorship of a master carpenter called Homer.
Amazing. Okay, so let's pause. That's a perfect pausing place, actually. Can we have some feedback from the community about this conversation in terms of, I mean, what things are coming up for you as we think about poetry as this perfect chariot wheel, or about Homer, about the way things fit together? Bill, yeah.
You know, when you first started talking, about how there was other cycles, it occurred to me at one time in my life I was really into the medieval, the Charlemagne cycle, and there's a whole bunch of medieval epic cycles that just really popped in my mind at that moment, because they're just as involved as the Homeric cycle.
Oh yes, and those cycles are also historically, independently, derived from oral traditions. Another good one, William, is of course the huge medieval body of narratives. There, Kimmy, I used the word body again, about the Holy Grail, the old French mega version, which, by the way, is still not available to the public in any one grand edition. So, at least not online. It is in print, but not online. Frustration.
Greg, because I mean, in part this has to do with issues of multitextuality, right?
Yes.
And is that something maybe at a later point in the conversation we can get to, actually? Because I think these are important topics for our community in general.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Well, why don't I make a placeholder, because I don't want to give a long-winded disquisition on multitextuality. I think the one I just gave about cycle will do for it today, but to try to say this very, very, very briefly, multitextuality is a term that I came up with when I was inspired by the research of people who were doing work on Old French lays,
right.
and not just lays, but other forms of poetry and songmaking. And to make it very, very, very brief, the term multi-text, as I use it, was inspired by the way medievalists were studying Old French poetry and songmaking.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that when you look at, let's say, a song attributed to a great troubadour like Geoffrey Rudel, R-U-D-E-L, when you look at all the manuscript versions of Song X, you cannot find any written version that is basic, that is foundational, from which all the other versions derive. They are all multiforms. And when I say multiform, I'm using a term that Albert Lord, my teacher, used to love to use. And so you could say they're multi-texts, reflecting the multiformity. And I think that'll be enough. I do have on the website of the CHS my basic statement about multitextuality, which originally appeared in a book edited by Jerome McGann, the great English professor. And I remember the subtitle of the book, it was The Shape of Things to Come. The problem with the book was that almost immediately after it was published in print, the publishing house, Rice University Press, went out of business. So I thought, great, so that's the shape of things to come. But at least my article on multitextuality got into an escape pod and was ejected into outer space, and you can read it in the outer space of the CHS website.
Okay, thank you. So, but do we have more comments about the idea of the chariot wheel, actually? Because I think, Sarah, did you have your hand up before?
Yes, one of the images I had when you were talking about a chariot wheel, once it's crafted by whatever means, whether it's a master carpenter or a team of carpenters or whatever, and that skill is passed on from one generation to another. So that was one image that kind of came to mind. And the other was when it's actually being used on a chariot. Coming back to the word cycle, and it moves around, but it also moves forward.
Yes.
So you've got that
Beautiful
sense of a performance, but also a performance that moves on in time.
And you know, William actually asked me a question online about a passage in Pindar, Nemean 10, and Pindar is such a wonderful channeler of very, very, very old metaphors. And a reason I mentioned Pindar in this context is you would have a lot of fun just reading Pindar and finding instances where the movement of the song corresponds to the turning of the chariot wheel as it gets going on its trajectory, okay? So that could be a great project where you just find, I'm sure you'll find at least half a dozen examples of exactly what you were saying as poeticized and metaphorized in Pindar. And William, I do want to address what you were saying to me about Nemean 10 of Pindar, but I'll do that when Claudia says it's time to do it.
Well, no, we could do it. Yeah, no, we could do it anytime. I just want to see, you know, I think that the issues and the metaphors that you have raised right now actually are so crucial to our understanding about the poetry. So I just wanted to see if other people had any comments or questions about what you've already said. Yeah, Jessica, please.
So I have a very simple question, which is, I believe Cedric Whitman, when he writes about the Iliad, speaks beautifully about ring composition.
Yes.
So do you find that relates to this idea of cycle? This
yes.
idea.
Beautiful. And I have just one small correction, which is that Cedric Whitman was my teacher.
Oh.
My student. But I guess I'm so old that by now it doesn't make a difference who was whose teacher or student. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Cedric Whitman, in this lovely book published in 1958 on Homeric poetry, I thought showed better than anybody else how ring composition works, that basically you come full circle whenever you start a subject and you wind right around and reach it again. I would make one qualification about ring composition, but I don't want to elaborate on this now because I want to hear your thoughts rather than just go on with my thoughts. But that is that every time you come full circle, there's a movement of the point that you reach when you come full circle. So that keeps progressing. So every time you go full circle, by the time you reach full circle, there has been a progression of the point where you reach full circle, and you can map that on a horizontal line as a progression. So ring composition is still moving the narrative along or the description along. And so this goes back to that beautiful metaphor of the chariot wheel. As it turns, the trajectory keeps pushing ahead and working its way towards its goal.
Okay, that's excellent. So that's interpretation.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And but like, you know, what Cedric Whitman can show in his 1958 book, and there's a very graphic illustration. It has a fold out at the end, and you fold it out, and the entire Iliad is charted in terms of what comes full circle where. And it's a marvel to see, and I say, okay, that works.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So, Greg and Ali, we actually have a question in the Q&A section.
Yes, I see
yeah.
it. I see one, and even with my failing vision, I can read it, which is that given that nostos and nestor come from the same verb, neomai, is there a connection between the return to homeland and the hero as its savior? And I say yes. Could Agamemnon's fatal return be characterized as nostos as well? Well, yes, but it's a failed nostos, and he says so himself in Odyssey 24, where he says, well, it almost worked, but it didn't. So it's a model, but a failed model.
Right. So, you know, one of the reasons that I was interested in raising that question at this time is because I'm wondering about this idea of the circle of the wheel and nostos, right?
Yes.
So how are those related, or should we be thinking about that? I mean, is there a connection there with the metaphor of the chariot wheel and nostos in general?
Oh, yes. Yes, coming full circle is something that's so built into the master narrative of the Iliad, as well as any specific part of the Iliad that you could say it's the plot of the Iliad.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. And you know, my favorite moment is when, well, there are many favorite moments, but okay, I'll just do two headlines. One, when Odysseus comes out of Hades, he finds himself in the far east, but when he went to Hades, he was in the far west, so he's come full circle just by going to Hades and coming back. Then there's the sunrise at the moment that Odysseus' ship, or the ship that carries Odysseus, makes contact with the shore of his homeland, Ithaca. Mm-hmm. That's also a coming full circle of the sun. And there are lots of elaborations and variations on the theme. So I think I'll content myself with saying that much, because I also see a comment from Noel Spencer.
Yes.
Who is new here, because he's somewhere here in Washington, in fact, in this building. So
I just invited him actually to our hangout. So here's the link to the article on multitextuality. So
well, you got it. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Submitting near to everyone's watching. So Noel, if anyone has benefited by reading the articles that are online at the Center for Hellenic Studies on the website, they've benefited from the work of Noel Spencer. I know I'm greatly in his debt. So we're all very grateful to him. So, all right, guys, how about any other questions? You know, we could be very informal and talk to each other, and we can talk to Greg and Ali. So, anyone, something else coming up?
Yes, yeah. Anything.
Greg.
Yes.
Hi. You say about the composition and performance, the same process. The process of recomposition is where the question, the ability of the poet comes alive.
Oh, you're saying that
right.
Whether you're good at it or not good at it, I'll say this in this stark American way, whether you're an accomplished practitioner of oral poetry, or not so accomplished, or even a bad practitioner of oral poetry. You're asking me, can you measure that in the composition? Well, yeah, you can also measure it in the performance. Again, you can't really separate them.
Mm-hmm. And because a lot of that has to do with the interaction with the audience, and not the audience in terms of passive audience, but in terms of the group that's participating along with the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, dear Renan, I can tell you a funny, what shall I call it, aphorism, which is, I love to say this, there's no such thing as an alienated oral poet. And what I mean is that if I really hate the guts of my audience, then how will I communicate with them?
Hmm. Hmm.
Especially if they hate you too.
So that's interesting. All right, guys, what else is coming up for people in terms of their reading of Light?
I just wanted to make a comment about ring composition.
Yes.
As a writer, it strikes me as how it adds to the dramatic effect. It's that whole thing about if you're giving a class, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Well,
Yes.
when you see that in the Iliad, it's just agonizing because someone is spreading some really, something awful just happened, and then the next person is told about it, then the next person, then it happens, then tell what happened. And it's a great dramatic tool, but so from a writer's perspective, that's what I see.
I totally agree. Does anybody want to ask me anything about Iliad 10? And I would just give my own take. I don't want to spoil the experience of what you'll hear from my colleagues Casey Douay and Mary Ebbett, who have written a whole book on Iliad 10, but I'm happy to try to address any of the problems that have come up. Go for it.
I don't have a question about Iliad 10. I just have one question about oral poetics and composition based on a comment you made at the last hangout about predictions within narrative. And yes. you mentioned Tiresias's prediction as though it was both part of the
Yes.
Odyssey's narrative and also outside of it.
Yes.
So could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes.
Please? Thank you.
And as I try to address that beautiful question, I don't necessarily have a pat answer. All I can say is that prophecies, predictions, within a given composition do not necessarily have to follow the rules of what is actually narrated in that composition. And certain rules can be broken. And I remember I was thinking when I said that the last time of how there's a prophecy about the immortalization of Menelaus after death, which is something that doesn't happen in the narrative of Homeric poetry. Nobody gets immortalized in front of your eyes after death within the narrative, but here you have a prophetic voice saying that this will happen to Menelaus. And you remember I was saying that doesn't count. Here's another one which isn't even so much a full-fledged prophecy but a threat. If I am a hero and I'm saying to another hero within Homeric narrative, I'm going to kill you and leave your body to be prey to dogs and birds that will devour you, you're just saying that to the other hero. You're predicting something that you hope will happen because you hate the other hero so much. But you know what? It never happens in the Iliad and the Odyssey. You never get to see in your field of vision somebody who's dead and whose corpse is being devoured by dogs and birds. That's just this horrible thing that can happen off stage. It doesn't happen on stage. And you know, you could compare what happens in tragedy, where on stage you never get to see anybody killing anybody. That will happen off stage, and then a messenger's speech will help you visualize it. But there you are. Does that help?
Somewhat.
Yes. Well, okay. Let me try something else, which is that in some kind of narratives, prophecies are not even a very desired thing to mention, or the content of prophecies. So there are different kinds of etiquette or convention, and a lot of people who don't care for oral poetics and would like to explain the Iliad and the Odyssey in terms of a written text will say it this way: is, oh, Homer is so classical, he is so refined that he refuses to talk about superstitions, quote unquote, or he underplays prophecies, he underplays love stories, and it goes on and on and on. So you see what I'm saying? It's also a matter of the rules of the game, and Homeric poetry does have very strict rules. By Homeric poetry now, I mean the historical artifacts of the textual transmission of the Iliad and the Odyssey as they have come down to us. So I'm trying to be historical about it, but it's one of those things where oral poetry or oral traditions in general have so many different rules in different situations.
Greg, can I ask a follow-up question about that? So, you know, as we're thinking about oral poetry and oral traditions, and a performer composing in the moment of performance, right?
Yes.
All at one moment. I mean, how does that technique allow someone, or I'm wondering if there's something special about that technique that facilitates someone to sort of mentally move both backward in time and forward in time, right? So, I mean, the fact that you have access to sort of traditional, and I mean, even maybe we could back up for a second and say, what do we mean by traditional poetry? Is that clear, like a tradition?
Yes. Well, here's a way to do it, which is that when people like Doug and Lenny and myself, to think of that very old generation of students of Albert Lord, if we ever use the word improvisation in Albert Lord's presence, he would get very upset. Because I think in his time he would think of improvisation as, I don't know, a smoke-filled room in San Francisco where people are free associating from one thought to another and call it poetry. And so for him, something that wasn't systematic, something that wasn't maintained by what is sometimes called a kind of long-term audience, a reception where people expect to hear certain things because that's what they're expecting, period. So for him, that was not improvisation. Improvisation sounded for him too much like free association. So he didn't want it to be free association. But if you said to him, oh, what I mean is riff in jazz, to give one example, oh, well, that's okay, because there it's a system, it's a set of conventions, and the thing is that those conventions will be there when you're gone, and when the audience to whom you're performing is gone, they'll still be there. That's tradition. So it's a system of communication that outlasts any one occasion. And if you think of that, well, that is improvisation. So it's not that, oh, I don't know what I'm going to say next. That's impossible. If you're like that, you're a bad oral poet, because you're not going to have an audience if you don't know what you're going to say. And then if you wing it, and if your winging it succeeds, it succeeds only because somehow you plug into some other aspect of the system even if it was serendipity, but you did.
Hmm. You know, that's interesting. I'm wondering if that raises any questions for people about formulas. You know, we've talked in the Heroes Project in our community about formulaic language and about maybe how that works in composition and performance. Anyone thought about that, or they have other questions that are coming up for them from what Greg has said?
Well, and I know I'm talking too much. This session has had, you know, it was like Greg talking 90% of the time and other people, or 95% of the time. So this is no dialogue, and I'm embarrassed. But going back to Homeric questions, I have something very funny there. It's supposed to be a parody of 10 Commandments. It's 10 ways of talking about oral poetry and 10 ways that you should try to avoid talking about oral poetry, because if you talk in those 10 ways, it means you've never had, shall we say, an Anthropology 101 experience. So there, I have some, I hope, clever things to say about formula. The word formula has been so overused and so misused.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to try to find a page number. So you keep talking amongst yourselves.
Okay.
When I find a page number.
So guys, so can some people want to take off their silent microphones, and let's chat a bit, okay? Let's just pretend that Greg is not here, because I know we're all chatty, actually. That's the honest truth. We talk over each other all the time, okay? Yeah. So this is really informal. All right, let's just go, Janet. Let's just do it.
I was wondering about the process of the relationship between master singer and the singer in the making. How does become a singer? You have to learn the tradition, and it must be a long process. And maybe you can talk about Lord's experience in Yugoslavia.
I'm back.
Yes.
That was quick.
I'm back. And I can't resist saying that what you just said can be answered most beautifully by a chapter in Albert Lord's book where he talks about the oral poet as an apprentice. It's just to die for. It's such a good chapter. You will love it. Yeah. And you know, when I said talk amongst yourselves while I find a passage, so I found it. If you go to Albert Lord's classic work, The Singer of Tales, 1960 is when it was originally published, and if you look at page 47, I should have remembered the page number. It says, and I quote, "There is nothing in the poem that is not formulaic." Oh my goodness.
Okay, so what does that mean? So what does that mean, Greg?
Well, that just shows that 95% of the people who used the word formula and thought they really were channeling Albert Lord in the 60s and 70s and 80s didn't know what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. There'd be people running around measuring what percentage of formulaic language there is in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, or oh, in this section it's 71%, in this section it's 40%. Their criteria for formula are, I think, misguided. Lord himself showed that when you analyze something that was produced by way of oral tradition, everything in that is a product of formulaic behavior. And so the idea of surface repetitions, which is a very textual mentality, that's just looking at what MIT linguists call surface structure.
So what do you mean? What do you mean, Greg? Surface?
Well, surface structure is when you study the grammar of a system, of language as a system, where you study it only by looking at what you actually see on the surface. As opposed to studying the deep structure, where you see, where you try to analyze the system that generates whatever bubbles up to the surface at any given moment when somebody says something.
So can I ask you a question now? And I know I'm talking too much too, so everyone feel free to interrupt me as well. So listen, I'll be totally honest. This is something that I'm like incredibly passionate about. This is one of my great passions. So I mean, how can we access that? Let's say we're someone who doesn't have a lot of Greek language, or maybe no, very limited Greek. Maybe what I call just enough Greek to use tools like Perseus to look around. So, I mean, how do we access this, and how do we really understand that? I mean, it's nice to say we're going to go read Singer Tales, and I love it, it's beautiful, and I want to do it again. But when we're looking at text, I mean, what can we do in that way to understand?
Well, but dear Claudia, if you're going to go to Perseus, you know what that is like? That is like, and I admire it so much, but when you go to Perseus, it's like what happened to me when I got so frustrated at the end of episode 8 of Game of Thrones, where I said, I'm not going to be surprised so violently anymore. I want to find out what happens to these characters. So I found on the website a synopsis of all 4 books of George R.R. Martin. And I read it. It took me about 2 hours to read just the synopsis, and my head was exploding with all these names and plot lines, etc. And I realized, wait a minute, what the TV series is doing is taking 1% of that 100% repertoire and building from that a subsystem that you can actually absorb in 10 hours if you follow faithfully. But that's very different from just suddenly having the entire output of a tradition just dumped on you, even in synoptic form, even as a synopsis, let alone the whole thing. Don't even try to read the first 4 books of George R.R. Martin. So I don't. But I don't know if that helps in trying to think of how to make sense of this vast amount of systematic thinking, and how to see in any individual situation where suddenly you see the system at work, and it's a composition and performance. It's happening. How that translates into something that can keep going on, even beyond my time and my place, and your time and your place.
I found this one of the hardest concepts to understand when I first approached Hour 24, Ancient Heroes. And the only thing, I always try to grab something in modern life to try to help me through it. And the thing that came to mind was comedy, stand-up comedy, because it might sound very serendipitous, but it's so highly structured.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Robin Williams will say the same thing. He has a repertoire. He says the same thing over and over again, but sometimes he's an old Yiddish lady, sometimes he's a rap singer, sometimes he's this. So it always sounds new, but it's the same. It's the same sort of shtick. And he's great enough that he can make it funny and fresh, but it's the same thing. He's saying the same thing.
Yeah.
That's how and I don't know if that's a correct analogy, but that's what I use to help myself explain it.
It's good to think with, and I think of that famous scene, and I actually tried to write it up in a kind of brief way in Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours. It's where Telemachus is saying to his mother, don't try to stop the singer when he's trying to sing the Nostos, the homecoming of the Achaeans. And we just hear a reference to it. We don't know what exactly the singer is singing. And he goes on to say, the thing that people appreciate most in a performance is whatever is new. And it's very funny when oral poetics talks about what is new. New just means what happens now, as opposed to what happened at the last performance. And the situation always changes, even if the ideology of what you're saying is that it's the same old, same old. It's never the same old, same old. It's always new. And in poetry as performance. And if there's one thing I would love for you to do as a takeaway from this experience, since now you know how to go to the website of CHS and go to Greg's poetry as performance, look up, do a word search for Kierkegaard. This is the philosopher Kierkegaard. I'm trying to pronounce it as close to the Danish as I can by leaving the D out. And he has this lovely formula for what is repetition. And he says there's backward repetition and there's forward repetition. And when you're repeating forward, the very fact that you're repeating something old makes it new.
Well, that's a great thing about the chariot wheel, because even though it's going forward, it looks like it's going backwards.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, but it's going forwards, yeah.
Hey, somebody write this down.
Right? I mean, it's an optical illusion that it looks like it's going backwards.
This is such an amazing insight. This was worth the price of admission. I love that.
Well, it's always fascinating.
I hope that, we're reaching a whole hour of Greg just talking and talking and talking at you. And this is exactly the nightmarish version of a dialogue. but it all comes together in that beautiful visual observation of yours. Wow.
Oh, thanks.
But Claudia, do we keep a record of great moments?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we do actually, in fact, and after our hangouts, actually, many of us meet to talk about it and debrief. So
well, this one gets a prize. This one gets a prize.
And we always want to continue these conversations in our community. So, and there may be other questions, but since today is actually a little bit more informal, here's the other thing I want to propose to you, Greg, in front of everybody, which is that one of the great experiences I had in the Heroes X project was getting to sit with you and talk about focus passages. So I was wondering about if maybe in our future open house sessions, if we might want to choose a focus passage ahead of time for the community to discuss, right, and think about and just talk about it in an informal way.
I love that. And you know what? That I think would make it more of a dialogue. And while I'm thinking of dialogue, I do see both Yorios Spiliopoulos and Noel having really good things. And I see Judy Reed has come into the picture. Where is Judy? What is her question? I'm so excited.
The questions are above the
Oh, the question is above. Oh my God, there it is.
It's like a talk bubble.
Oh my God. Okay. So can I quickly do a Judy Reed question?
Yeah, please do them. Yes.
It's not that Judy Reed is teacher's pet, but maybe she is, in the sense that we went to Greece together, and she gave this amazing interview to Camilla, which we're going to make public. And her question is, in Iliad 10, is Dolan meant to be a comic character in a satire? He seems to be ludicrously out of touch with reality, and after Odysseus' clever manipulation of his terror, Diomedes sends him off by removing his head. Well, I think there's a lot to it. And another way to put it is that he's a carnivalesque figure, and here I'm using the hermeneutics, that is to say the explanatory devices of that great Russian thinker Bakhtin, B-A-K-H-T-I-N. And there are all sorts of things in Iliad 10. Unlike any other narratives, heroes are fighting at night, not in the daytime. They're observing rules that are different from the rules that apply when heroes are on camera in the daytime. They do things that they wouldn't be caught dead doing, excuse my playing with words, in the daytime. And as it turns out, this is a very, very, very old poetic tradition where night fighting is a different world from day fighting, putting a premium on ambush instead of one-on-one fighting, allowing for all sorts of deceitful maneuvers as opposed to mano-a-mano maneuvers, and the list goes on and on and on. And I think Judy is really onto something here. And could I also just quickly mention what Noel is saying, since I see it staring me in the face? Can we talk about Iliad 10 briefly in terms of multiformity as opposed to interpolation? And Noel, you're right. That question is a preview of what Casey Douay and Mary Abbott will talk about. Interpolation, the I word, is something that people use if they're only thinking in terms of text. and forget to think in terms of performance and composition. That said, it is true that in any given story you can blow it up, you can shrink it, or to use Albert Lord's terminology, you can expand and compress. And of course, when you expand, a person who can only think in terms of text will say, "Oh, I see an interpolation between point X and point Y." Well, yeah, it is something that is woven in, but it's not some textual insert that happens independently of everything else that's going on.
So what do you mean, a textual insert that's independent, right? Can you say what you mean by that?
Well, I'm struggling here because I'm trying to look at it from a textual point of view, which is when I hear interpolation, then it means that somebody in another time and another place thought it was important to add something.
Right.
And the flip side of that is removing something, but let's not deal with that now. Okay, so you're adding something, but the mindset is that it's a different time and different place. And technically, you can add something at the same time and same place to something that people expect from previous times. Is that a clever way to say it? So, adding and subtracting, or put it another way, expanding and compressing, is a dynamic process that, in a tradition, presupposes that things can go the other way the next time, just as they may have gone another way the previous time.
Right. So it's all part of the system, and what you're saying is there are different multiforms of different myths. Is that what you're?
And again, if we don't have a live recording of an oral tradition, and all we have is a textual record, then of course we're tempted to think only textually, and you say, "Oh, this doesn't belong here," or "This is an addition." This is anyway. You're talking about it in a way that doesn't give you the wiggle room that I want, which is that these things, if they're not just textual, can be part of the tradition, and the reception of the tradition. People who've heard the story a gazillion times will be used to having compressed or expanded versions. They will not only be used to it, they'll expect it. And after all, look, I spent a whole book, Best of the Achaeans, talking about a 10-line version of the Iliad as embedded in Odyssey A. And I say, well, in those 10 lines, I see everything that I see in the Iliad. People say, "Come on, Greg, you can't see everything that you see in the Iliad." But yes, I can, if I'm thinking traditionally, if I'm thinking not only in terms of this 10-line thing and the 15,000-line thing that is the Iliad, I'm thinking of everything in between. That's what tradition is. That's the beauty of it. And if you're thinking only textual, you're basically mincing little cross sections, and that's fine too. But then what do you do with them if you think of them only as something textual? Do the various dialects in ancient Greece have anything to do with compression and expansion? Because I was just thinking, again, a stand-up comedy, Eddie Izzard, my favorite comedian, he's doing a series of a new comedy act, and he tried it out in Connecticut in 3 languages, because he's going to do it in 3 different languages. Wow. The
same, shtick there. But he was talking about how he had to compress some of it or expand some of it, depending on whether he was speaking in English or French or German. Beautiful. That the volume of the words was different. Now, would that have something to do also with multiformity?
Again, you're going to be so sick of Greg plugging his greatest hits, but
never.
I have an article about Aeolic ways of doing the Iliad and Odyssey.
Okay.
And we can share that with you I've even tried to reconstruct how an Iliad would be like on the island of Lesbos, on Sappho's island. And, you know, I should say, when I was there, I've been there twice, the unforgettable experiences. Did you know that they have a Mount Olympus themselves? And that if you look at it, you say, well, gee, that's the Mount Olympus that I imagine in my Iliad, so to speak. And it's just breathtaking. And it's not that people today call it Mount Olympus. It's always been called Mount Olympus. Even before the Iliad as we know it took shape, it was Mount Olympus. And what I'm saying, in that Iliad, in that Iliadic tradition, there are all sorts of different things that happen. And Achilles' tomb will be in a different place in Asia Minor, and all sorts of genealogies and actions will be different. And yes, it'll be shorter probably. And did you know that in the body of fragments attributed to Sappho that has come down to us, and it's pathetically small, but Sappho fragment 44 is actually a snippet from an Aeolic Iliad composed by a woman.
Okay, yeah.
And it's the wedding of Hector and Andromache, and it's to die for. And I wrote a whole book on it in 1974. I mean, I published it in 1974. It took eternities to write. But yes, that was a long-winded answer to this beautiful question. Yes, there is. Yes, Virginia, there is an Aeolic. Just as there is an Ionic Iliad. In fact, our Ionic Iliad still has in its recessive language traces of the Aeolic Iliad, and that's what my article shows. The one that, if you search for Aeolic, you'll among the titles of Greg, you'll find it.
Yeah. And so Noel has shared a link. Actually, Noel has shared the link to that as well.
Thank you.
Yay, Noel! Yay!
Yay, Noel! Boy, Noel is a real lifesaver. I would love for you to read that. See what you think.
Oh, that's great. Because, like I said, that was probably the hardest concept. That and Scroll 9, but I feel like I'm getting there on Scroll 9. But just this whole thing of, yeah.
Go ahead. I cut you off.
Yeah, just the whole idea of the oral poetics, the compression, and the words, and the not serendipity of it, but the immediacy, the transmission back and forth. You know, it just took a long time to get in my head what was really being talked about. And I know I'm still not there yet, but I have a glimpse.
If it makes you feel better, I'm not there yet either.
Yeah.
I had this amazing experience in Beijing when Lenny and I did a gig together on the Iliad to the Institute for Ethnic Literature there. And Lenny gave a paper that had an insight that he never had before and I never saw before, which is that the 3 times that Achilles speaks in response to the 3 speeches of the 3 ambassadors, quote-unquote ambassadors, each time he is changing his mind and saying different things and showing that he's actually morphing from one character to another. It's an amazing insight. I'm not doing justice to it. Next time Lenny appears with me, we should twist his arm to give you a much better summary than I've been able to do. But my point is that I'm not done with Iliad 9 either. There's still so much to discover. That's a very, very high maintenance part of the Iliad.
Yes, like quicksand. It never ends. It keeps going down.
Quicksand sounds sinister.
No. Okay.
Let's find another metaphor.
Okay.
Okay, but you know what? Actually, it's 12:03, so it's time for us to end our discussion.
But you can't. We haven't talked about Diomedes and his immortalization in Pindar's Nemean 10.
Oh,
so
yes.
Yeah.
This is dedicated to you, and I'll shut up after saying this. It's an amazing example of Pindaric references to myths of immortalizations of heroes after death. And in the same breath that he mentions Diomedes being immortalized, he mentions Amphiaraus being immortalized. and it's a gem, and we should talk about that at length. But obviously, the sands of time have run out of this clock.
Okay, so here's my thought for next time. We can choose 1 or 2 focus passages. We'll share them among ourselves in this group and with the wider community, the things that we're going to discuss, maybe the focus passages, and then our conversation can develop around those.
I think that's a great idea, because otherwise you're going to have a history of the world as told by Greg, or maybe a cosmology starting from the Orphic egg and working right into the present, or a Russian novel, or whatever.
No, but I think these topics that we talked about today are so important, and it's important that we have these links to these articles.
They're all important.
Yeah. Okay, Greg and Ali, thanks so much. It was so great talking with you this Thursday. And we'll see everyone next Thursday, same time. I think Lenny's scheduled to join us.
I think so, and let's make sure that we award a prize for that beautiful metaphor of the visual effect of the spinning wheel.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Okay. Everyone have a great day.
I just got it. Thanks. That was it.
Take care.
Bye.